The least of things with a meaning is worth more in life than the greatest of things without it. That's a quote from the Swiss psychologist and psychiatrist Carl Jung. Many of the world's wisdom traditions express similar ideas. The Bible speaks of the simple treasures of the heart far exceeding in value those of the material world. Islam embraces modesty and talks of the meaning to be found in doing for others. Many of the Eastern traditions emphasize compassion and the letting go of unnecessary attachments. Anyway, I always really liked that quote, and I had thought I understood it. I found out this summer that I didn't. Not really. Not the way we understand things down deep in the gut, down in the cellular level, in the soul. I spent this summer doing a unit of professional education for ministry students about pastoral care. I was assigned to a group of 6 other seminary students, 3 Episcopalians, a Presbyterian, a Catholic, and a Muslim. Sounds like a setup for one of those jokes, doesn't it? 3 Episcopalians, a Presbyterian, a Catholic, a Muslim, and a Unitarian Universalist are in a bar. Of course, since we were all ministry students, that never happened. Much. Okay, some of us sometimes. Those Episcopalians, I tell you, party animals. Anyway, we spent the summer learning together while serving as chaplains at local hospitals. I was assigned to Brackenridge Hospital, where I worked on a floor that provided care for people struggling with a number of illnesses. We were also required to take turns serving as the on-call chaplain overnight, covering 4 local hospitals. During on-call shifts, our home base would be the little chaplain sleep room down in the basement of Brackenridge Hospital. Some of my fellow students, the Episcopalians, decided that the sleep room was haunted. Being a good rationality-based Unitarian Universalist, I secretly dismissed that notion and did my best to ignore the inexplicable sounds that often startled me awake at 3 in the morning, uneasy and shivering in the little sleep room in the basement of the hospital. The day before my first on-call shift, I was too slow to react while driving, and I hit another car from behind. No one was hurt, but my car was damaged pretty badly and not drivable. We managed to pull the cars off the road into a parking lot and called for a police officer and a tow truck. I was fretting about my car, fretting about how I was going to arrange to have something to drive for the upcoming on-call shift, fretting about how much all of this was going to cost me. But as we stood waiting together, the young guy whose car I had hit asked me what I did for a living, and so I told him about being a seminarian. He said, "Oh, wow, can I talk to you about something?" And so that's how it happened that I ended up in a parking lot off North Lamar Boulevard, standing around in 103-degree heat, leaning against my wrecked car and providing pastoral care for the guy whose car I had just crunched. Suppose it was the least I could do. The funny thing was, after listening to his story, my wrecked car seemed the least of things to worry about. By the way, though I've tried to keep the essence of the stories I will tell you today intact, I'm changing enough details to protect the privacy and identity of those involved. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital in my freshly acquired rental car at 8 a.m. My pager went off immediately, calling me to the emergency room. When I got there, a woman was lying on a stretcher holding the body of her 21-year-old daughter. The daughter had just died from injuries she sustained during a car wreck in which the mom had been driving. That mom's sorrow filled the air, and for a while, it was all that there was to breathe. Over the next 5 hours with her and the other family members, there were no words that would console the inconsolable. The only thing anyone could do was just to stay with them in their grief. And yet, somehow, families hold each other's and tell their stories and hold tightly to the love that exists between those who survived and begin the process of honoring the memories of those who were lost. And somehow, they pick themselves up and leave the hospital and find a way to go on with their lives. Their stories continue, including those of the ones who were lost. It is a testament to courage and the resilience of the human spirit that defies even the tragic, that overcomes even great loss. Later that day, I went down to the little sleep room and I called my partner Wayne and I said, "I need you to stay on the phone with me while I cry." And he did. And I love him so much. You see, that little chaplain sleep room in the basement of the hospital is haunted. It's haunted with memories so strong, losses so profound, yet courage, love, and the will to live on so boundless that they awaken you at 3 a.m. and demand to be heard. But you know, somehow, so often we miss the things that really matter. Instead, we make the greatest of things out of the stuff that's not really that important at all. In fact, some of the things to which we assign such meaning are actually almost comical if you think about them. Here's just a few examples of some of the things we make way more important than they really are, that when you really think about how much meaning they truly have, are the least of things. Most church budget battles. Anything having to do with reality television. What the neighbors think of our car, house, clothing, etc. UT football. Don't throw things at me, I like it too. Most of the material things in our lives. Now, don't get me wrong, I know we love our Priuses and iPads. I do too, and to a certain extent, enjoying them is great. But we also have to remember what truly brings us comfort and joy and meaning and beauty. And that's where a paradox of the least of things comes in. There are things that can seem so small, so unimportant, yet they can be so meaningful, so powerful, so life-giving. A kind word, a loving gesture, the friend who shows up to visit just when we need them. Prayer. I know as we often shy away from prayer, and yet, as a chaplain, I was called upon to pray with people and to do so in religious language that you might never hear in a Unitarian Universalist church. And I saw prayer calm the disturbed, bring hope and peace to families experiencing great loss, release the tears that allowed people to finally express their grief so that they could begin to reclaim hope. Here's just one example. Late one evening, I was called to the room of a woman who was too distraught to sleep. She had just made it through a protracted legal battle to regain custody of her children from an abusive husband, only to be diagnosed with leukemia. We talked for a while, and she shared both laughter and tears. Finally, she asked if I would pray for her, and I asked her what she would like me to pray for. She answered, for God to be with her children. And so we prayed the prayer she needed together. At the end of the prayer, she squeezed my hand and said, I think I can go to sleep now. Later, she said it was the first time she had slept through the night in months. Later, she looked at me one day and said, "You know, I'm starting to be able to laugh and tell jokes with my kids again." That one might seem counterintuitive, but it's another of those seemingly little things that can be so meaningful. Humor. So often, humor can bring light into the darkest of situations, bring humanity to people who had been feeling as if they had become their disease. This summer, I got to know an older gentleman who was in for surgery to remove a non-malignant mass attached to his brain. We had talked several times before his surgery. He'd expressed his fears about it and talked to me about some decisions he had made in life that he regrets now. The afternoon after his surgery, I saw him walking around in the hallway with the help of a physical therapist. He smiled, pointed to the stitches on his head, and said, "Hey, chaplain, they say I can go home tomorrow. The new brain fits just fine." Before I even could think about it, I laughed and said, "Well, I hope it works a lot better than the last one did." Luckily for me, we had formed a relationship that already included humor, so he returned the laugh. There are so many of those little things that can matter so much, but what it seems to always come down to is loving presence. It always comes back to relationship, for love for one another and the sacred, fragile web of existence of which we are part. One Sunday, I brought a young woman back to the intensive care unit to see her younger brother. He had just died as the result of an accident. She had fought with him before he left for work that morning and needed to say goodbye and seek forgiveness before the rest of the family would get there. As we stood by his bed and she spoke the words that she needed to say to him, she suddenly turned and placed her head on my shoulder, cupped a hand over each of my shoulders, and collapsed her entire weight onto me. I hadn't expected this, and it was as if her body had suddenly become a stone weight, and her overwhelming grief was pouring into me through the tears she was shedding on my shoulder. In that moment, I thought I would collapse too, that I didn't have the strength and that we were both going to fall down in great puddles of sorrow on the cold tile floor of that room in the ICU. But we didn't. And somehow the experience was as if something was holding me up so that I could keep holding her up. Rebecca Ann Parker, one of our UU theologians, calls this an upholding and sheltering presence that is alive and afoot in the universe. Others might simply call this God. Still others might say it's some sort of biopsychological reserve built deeply into our DNA that helps us to help others survive so that our species can go on. I'm happy just to dwell in the awe and wonder and mystery of it. I am just grateful for it. I think that it has everything to do with love. That young woman was eventually able to go on not because of anything I or anyone else did, but because there was love in that room that Sunday. Love that transcends everything else. Love that upholds us. Love that we carry with us always and that is simply present. It is there, and we can find it in the least of gestures, the fewest of words, the silences we share when there is nothing to be said, and yet we stay connected with one another nonetheless. Simple, loving presence can be the least of things, and yet the most meaningful of things. It is where we find purpose, a comforting hand on a shoulder, a kind word, a meal for an ailing neighbor, just remembering to say, I love you, before leaving the house in the morning. These are where we ultimately find meaning. These are the things worth more in life. For all I know, that loving presence with each other and within all of life and creation is the place where, in the end, we find beauty and truth and joy. For all I know, it is where God lives. Amen.